Hey everybody, Professor Moore here, and today I want to talk about one of the greatest crimes in human history, how Europe stole Africa during the age of imperialism. Imperialism is the process of an empire going to another country and taking it over by force. The goal is to conquer, colonize, and control that territory to exploit its resources and its people for the benefit of the empire. The age of imperialism was sparked by the Industrial Revolution. All of the countries that industrialized first, such as Britain, France, and Germany, used their technological advantage to violently take over other countries and steal their resources. One of their main targets was Africa because this continent was rich in desirable resources, such as gold, tin, copper, palm oil, rubber, and diamonds. Starting in 1882, Britain led the way by taking over direct control of Egypt. The colonial officials who ruled Egypt did so with the racist attitude that Egyptians were not civilized enough to rule themselves. For example, the British colonial official Sir Evelyn Baring said, "The people of Egypt have for centuries past been a subject race. They do not possess the qualities which would render it desirable, either in their own interest or in those of the civilized world in general, to raise them to the category of autonomous rulers with full rights of internal sovereignty." When Britain took over Egypt, it sparked what was called the Scramble for Africa. Every major industrialized European power wanted a piece of Africa, and now it was a race to see who could get there first and take over as much as possible. The leader of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, realized that the Europeans needed to hold a meeting to set the rules of what was called the Great Game. So he called together the Berlin Conference in 1884, which was attended by officials from countries like Britain, Belgium, France, Italy, and Germany. At this meeting, these men established the standard by which any European country could claim African territory against a European rival. The goal was to provide clear rules and regulations in order to avoid a European war. At this conference, they put a giant map of Africa on the wall and talked about which countries would get which territory. The most important fact to emphasize about this meeting is that not a single African leader was invited, and no African country was even informed of the European intention to take over the continent. The Conference of Berlin was a meeting of criminals plotting to steal all of Africa, and they almost succeeded. In less than 30 years after this meeting, the imperial powers of Europe took over 10 million of Africa's 11 million square miles. By 1914, more than 90% of Africa had been taken over by European empires. Only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. If we look at this map, we can see that Africa practically became a European possession to be exploited and abused at their will. One French official at the Conference of Berlin confessed, "We are witnessing something never before seen in history, the actual partition of a foreign continent by a handful of European countries." In his classic novel, The Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad accurately described the age of imperialism as a massive crime against humanity. He wrote, "They were conquerors, and for that you want only brute force. Nothing to boast of when you have it, since your strength is just an accident arising from the weakness of others. They grabbed what they could get for the sake of what was to be got. It was just robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a great scale. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much." He's right. When we look at how Europeans took over Africa, we find that they did it with violence on an unimaginable scale. The way that Europeans conquered Africa was primarily with the machine gun. Europeans made sure to ban the sale of machine guns to all African countries to give them a clear advantage. They also used special bullets that were banned in Europe but approved for war in Africa. These bullets expanded inside the body and did much more damage than ordinary bullets. Often the African people that Europeans were fighting had far inferior weapons, such as old cheap rifles or even just wooden spears and bow and arrows. Europeans often spoke of colonial wars in Africa, but because of their possession of the machine gun, these were really just massacres. For example, in 1893, British soldiers armed with machine guns killed 3,000 people in an hour and a half in South Africa. In 1898, during the Battle of Omdurman in Sudan, the death toll was even higher. In 5 hours, British soldiers armed with machine guns fatally shot 11,000 people and wounded 15,000. One eyewitness said, "It was not a battle, it was an execution." Winston Churchill was there, and he described how the only problem that British soldiers had was getting cramps in their fingers from holding the triggers on machine guns for too long. He wrote in his diary how, on the other side, bullets were shearing through flesh, smashing and splintering bone, blood spouted from the terrible wounds, men were struggling on through a hell of whistling metal, exploding shells, and spurting dust, suffering, despairing, dying. This is how Africa was conquered, with machine guns and men willing to massacre thousands in their pursuit of greed and power. During the takeover of Africa, Britain was responsible for several atrocities and crimes against humanity. In 1899, Britain started a war in South Africa to take over that country's gold and diamonds. They met resistance from a group of Dutch settlers called the Boers, and this Boer War turned into a long and ugly affair. After thousands of British soldiers were killed, they adopted a scorched earth policy and burned down all Boer homes and farmlands. The survivors were placed in concentration camps, and the conditions were so terrible that over 50,000 people died. Between 1901 and 1902, 28,000 Boer people died in these camps, including 22,000 children. An additional 20,000 black South Africans died in these camps too. These camps were surrounded by electrified fences, so if anyone tried to escape, they would be shocked to death. But the vast majority died because of disease and starvation. When Britain took over South Africa, they ruled this country brutally and treated its people as disposable. One colonial governor said, "I have come deliberately to the conclusion that the African is the worst specimen of the human race that I have ever had to deal with." Another colonial governor instructed his men to rule the country as if there were no inhabitants. Once Britain gained control of South Africa, they brought in men like Cecil Rhodes to exploit its resources. Rhodes said that Africa was inhabited by the most despicable specimens of human beings, and he argued that the British are the finest race in the world, and the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. Rhodes went as far as to say that the entire world should come under British rule. In South Africa, Rhodes took over the diamond trade and created the De Beers Diamond Company, making him one of the richest men in the world. As governor, Rhodes forced black South Africans to work on his railroads and mines. Here's a picture of Rhodes' mansion in South Africa that was built with blood money. When Rhodes died, he left a large part of his fortune to Oxford University to use as scholarships to allow students to go to the college. Today, both the Rhodes Scholars Program and the De Beers Diamond Company still exist. However, in the past few years, people have begun to push back on the view of Cecil Rhodes as a British hero. Across South Africa, his statues have been vandalized, attacked, and torn down. In Britain, there was a campaign called Rhodes Must Fall that tried to get a statue of Cecil Rhodes removed from Oxford University. Even though this statue still stands today, it's clear that there are many people who will no longer tolerate the whitewashing of history or the continued praise of a white supremacist and imperialist criminal. Not only should Rhodes fall, but so should all of the statues honoring the criminals who took part in the stealing of Africa. If you want to learn more about how Europe stole Africa, read Walter Rodney's masterpiece, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. This book explains that the poverty we see in Africa today is not an accident, but the direct result of the crime of imperialism. And this is a crime that is still in progress.